I sped through that really fast. Is there any questions? Because this is where I wanted to get to. Okay. So that's every level of existence. I haven't talked about subatomics. We'll talk about that at the end a little bit. But life is the key to this conversation. And this is their golden goblet. This is what they focus on, is life can and did come about on its own somehow. They don't know yet, but somehow. So what's happened in recent years is people have decided to redefine what life is so they can say that they can make it. And this is happening quite a bit. But I wanted to ask you guys, because I was just interested in what you might say, is how do you define life? It's an interesting question. You guys can't answer, as you know. How would you define life? There are three or four categories that you need for life. So,
you're breathing, you're
okay.
There's life. There's it's alive.
Well, the first requirement of life is reproduction. If you can't replicate yourself, you have no life. Or if you did, you'd die and then you have no life again, right? So, reproduction. There's no life that doesn't reproduce itself, or there wouldn't be life. It's just that simple. What else do you need for life? Well, some life doesn't actually breathe, right? So we do, but there's creatures at the bottom of the sea that don't necessarily. They have a form of respiration, so it's possible. Every living creature starts how? As a new living creature, right? What happens after it is birthed? It grows, yeah, it grows. So, oops. Living creatures have to grow. If they don't grow, well, they're not living, right? What? It has to, well, it consumes, it kind of means something else, but it has to function in some manner, right? There has to be function. It has to have function, right? Whoops. I can't spell when I'm in front of the paper. Okay, so, and whatever its state is right now has to be different than what its state is going to be when it dies. So yeah, if a creature is alive, there must be a die or a dead version of it, right? If there's not, if it doesn't die, then there's not really life. You guys did actually pretty good. There actually is a definition, and this comes out of the Oxford Dictionary. Life is the condition that distinguishes animals and plants from inorganic matter, including the capacity to grow, reproduce, function, and change prior to death. So you grow, right? It's not just growing in size. You grow in your maturity. Every living creature has a different stage of their existence. It's more than just mere growth. That's change prior to death. Every living creature ages and eventually expires. So that's how we define life. It doesn't matter how they want to define life. That is life. And if you change the rules, then you're not proving anything. You just prove that you could change the rules, right? Okay, so origins of life and evolution. This is the fight we have as Christianity today. Is people are doing billions and billions of dollars of research to prove there's a way to create life in a laboratory, to prove that the origins of life is not God. And then once they have this, they'll say that there's some mechanism to get to us. This is what they commonly refer to as goo to you via the zoo, which means you started with a puddle and you went through all these stages of animals and voila, then there's you. Again, the atheists won't like that I said that and I'll get comments. It's okay. One thing about origins of life, let's say that some really smart scientist someday makes a living cell in a petri dish. What does that prove? It proves that a really smart person was able to do something that a really smart person did, God. I mean, the fact that we can make a chemical reaction that would make pseudo-life doesn't disprove God. It only proves that you're really, really smart. And good for you. I applaud you if it happens. It won't happen. I'm a scientist. Scientists should never say it can't happen. It can't happen. But I'll explain why I believe that. Other scientists won't be that. I don't work in the field anymore, so I can say that. It gets a little more complicated. It's got both micro and macro evolution. So the micro as in microscopic, macro, us. And what we'll see, and I won't talk about it very much today, but they discover new species of animals. Does that mean a new species was made, or does that mean they discovered it?
They just discovered it.
Commonly in the Western world, we'll go to someplace like the Philippines and we'll discover a new lizard. The local people have known it for thousands of years, okay? It's not new. It's just new to the American or British scientist that wants to put their name on it. And I get it, but that's not proof of evolution. In fact, if there was proof of evolution, you would see a continuum of organisms, not only in the fossil record, but in the world around us. Because we still have simple organisms, the microscopic, and now we have macroscopic. So where's the evidence in the continuum that we can observe any place? Now they'll say they have them, but read the fine print. It's creative. So, well, I don't think I have a video that talks about this, but microevolution, there's a guy upper Midwest, I can't remember what his name is. He's been doing experiments on E. coli for like 25 or 30 years now. I mean, millions and millions of generations of change. And he claims that he has created new genetic material. Oh gosh, you don't find any of that. But, well, they've tried to prove that there's microevolution using E. coli. And what we have found, when you look at his evidence, it's a degraded E. coli. It's not an improved E. coli. What always happens through genetic replication is loss of information, never gain of information. The so-called mutations that everybody talks about, mutations are generally not functional or irrelevant to the function. They either kill the cell or they're irrelevant and the cell doesn't bother to repair it. That's the only two kinds that anybody's ever witnessed, that anybody's ever... So when they say mutations is how we got blah, 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 there's no evidence of this. It's a very good, smart, intelligent person imagining a solution to a problem that doesn't exist. They make the problem because they don't want to admit that God is an option. If God was an option, they wouldn't look for so many imaginative solutions. All right, so who is this video? I think this is John Lennox. Listen to John.
I'm interested in truth. Was there a creator or was there not a creator? Now, I know this is a popular view today because Hawking popularized it. There's no need for a creator. There's nothing for a creator to do. But I've analyzed his arguments very carefully. In fact, I've written a book about them called God and Stephen Hawking. And his method of getting rid of a creator, to my mind, does not work at all. Because what he does, and others do the same thing, like Lawrence Krauss of Arizona State University, they talk about the universe. Well, let me quote Hawking to you. He says, because there is a law such as gravity, the universe can and will create itself from nothing. Now, when I first read that, and that's the key statement in the book by Hawking and Mlodinow, The Grand Design, that's the key statement, I was staggered because it's self-contradictory to start with.
everything has to exist. That's really what Hawkins is saying. There's gravity, so because there's a law of gravity, then the universe and the planet and everything has to come into existence or it wouldn't exist. And it's like, well, yeah, it has to exist to exist. That's not an argument for, it's what Lennox saying, it's a self-refuting statement. It's like, okay, yeah, the universe exists and things exist inside the universe, and those things that exist inside the universe only exist because the universe exists. Duh. And that is, Hawkins is thought to be one of the smartest men to ever live, and that's the stupidest statement I can imagine. And it's nice to have a really smart guy like John Lennox say it so I don't have to say it. He says it much nicer than I do. So let me take just a sidestep for a second before we get further into the origins of life. What's the difference between a weed and a flower?
That's true.
It's true. A weed is any plant that's growing where you don't want it. I mean, a coconut tree can be a weed, okay? It doesn't matter. If it's growing where you don't want it, it's a weed. And what happens in your vegetable garden if you don't remove the unwanted weeds? We probably aren't going to get any vegetables. So when we start talking about the organic chemistry, kind of think about weeds and vegetables. And the fact that without intervention, the weeds will take over and you get nothing useful. And it's very similar to the way natural chemistry actually takes place. Anything outside of a living cell that's not directed tends to always go toward the chaotic, unwanted, poisonous, toxic solution. And it's just the way it is. The useful stuff usually doesn't just happen, and if it does, it's in such a minority that the unuseful things choke it out. And that's really the place that origin of life is out right now. But the origin of life discussion is really complex, and I'm going to try to not scientize it too much. But if you look at it, just look at the evidence that's being presented and tell me if there is any. That's really what we're trying to test. It's like, do they really have evidence for what they claim? Because if they don't, and their only excuse for coming up with the theory is to prove there is not a God, yet their theories don't prove there isn't a God, they actually have no evidence at all. Here's another quick one. This is James Tour from here at Rice University.
Are there any other materialistic hypotheses that give you pause to either build or explain the origin of life?
Many people, for example, Richard Dawkins, they have appealed to life coming from another planet.
What's the best scenario I could think of? Life on this planet being intelligently designed, which is directed panspermia.
This whole idea of panspermia, it was delivered here either intentionally or unintentionally from another planet. But that doesn't solve anything because we're talking about the origin of first life. Where did first life come from? So I find it interesting that they're open to aliens coming in and dropping life here, but not opening to some other divine being.
So Richard Dawkins is probably the most well-known atheist. He's also a professor of biology. Okay, it comes down to understanding origin of life concepts. He's pretty high up in that category. Yet he thinks that the only solution he can imagine is that someone brought life to Earth. Well, that's the whole thing that Tour is trying to say. It's like, that doesn't change the conversation at all. Where did that life come? We're talking about first life. And in fact, we believe that an extraterrestrial brought life to Earth. It's called God, okay? He's not from Earth. That makes him extraterrestrial by definition. It's just that they ignore the obvious by saying the obvious. I mean, Richard Dawkins basically, without wanting to, says that our view is the best one. I mean, because directed panspermia, I had to look up. I mean, I was like, what are these things? And believe it or not, there are all kinds of theories on origin of life. I just put a few on the board. I can't explain them to you because even though I kind of understand what they're saying it does, I don't see how they get there, right? I mean, where'd the RNA come from in the first place? You know, a meteor brought life to Earth, but where did it have life on it to start with? You know, they'll say, oh, there were amino acids on asteroids. And I'm like, okay, what difference does that make? It's just a molecule. I mean, there's no reason to believe you can't have organic compounds. If there's carbon someplace and oxygen, you can have organic compounds. That's not life. That's just a carbon attached to something. So it's a little confusing, the strategies that they use. But they're very smart people. They have very good imaginations on coming up with these theories because you can't prove these. There's no evidence. But I want to give you just an example. This is from physics.org. This is February 28th of this year. This was the title of the article. It was Scientists Reveal How First Cells Could Have Formed on Earth. This is from Scripps Research Institute. I actually am a scientist, so I actually do read scientific journals, and I try to kind of stay up with their concepts because it's always interesting to see how they're approaching. Most of the titles, the headlines, are a little misleading. This one was very nice. It says, could have. Could have. And so let me just kind of give you a taste of what their could have looked like. Okay? So they say, and this is a goo to you via the zoo model, so just bear with me. But I mean, this is recent. This is just last month. So their theory is that there were these fatty acids on early Earth. Now, we'll for the moment, we'll ignore the fact I don't know how the fatty acids got there. Okay, so they got these fatty acids, and this is a relatively normal depiction of what a fatty acid looks like. It's got a carbon backbone with hydrogens hanging off it. The red ones are meant to be oxygens. They generally have shape to them. That's the reason you see the bend. It's just a typical fatty acid, right? Okay, so what they said is, let me make sure I get to the right place in my notes. I want to make sure I get their words instead of my words. So, okay. Anyway, these fatty acids, and well, I guess, remember, this is not a simple compound. This is a very complex organic compound. And what they want to do is they want to say that somehow, these fatty acids clumped together and made a lipid layer, which eventually became a bilipid layer. That's two layers of fatty acid, eventually is what a lipid is. And then somehow that bilayer became a three-dimensional shape, a sphere. These are often what they refer to as vesicles. Vesicles are a real thing. Your cells actually produce these things. It's one of the ways that we get rid of waste out of our body. Our human cells will entrap pollutants in vesicles and get them out. It's not the same as a micelle. If you know your science, micelle is like a soap bubble, where a vesicle is one made out of proteins, essentially. Vesicles have no real function other than to contain. But so what they said is basically these vesicles happened, okay, and I'm like, okay, we've never observed this, but okay, we can make these in the lab, so okay. And then somehow there was some other stuff inside this vesicle, and the layers rearranged and made what they call a protocell. And a protocell has some sort of, usually some free proteins inside. Some people even say a protocell is the first stage of a living organism. Protocells have never been made. They'll say they've made them, but if you look at it, they've never made them. what they make is a vesicule with stuff inside of it. To be a protocell, the membrane itself has to have some sort of function to it. It's not a bubble. It has to be a system that can pass things in and out selectively. But anyway, they said they had this protocell, and there was the right kind of nucleic acids inside. In fact, probably RNA that magically became DNA inside this protocell, and then, boom, you got life. And that's a cross-section of a mammalian cell. And you see the complexity. So you go from basically a ball of fat with stuff inside of it, and they claim that this is due to something they call phosphorylation. Phosphorylation is a real thing. It's a chemical reaction. But the idea that this phosphorylation would somehow take random nucleotides and make a double helix out of it, I don't know how they get there. We can't reproduce it in a laboratory even when we're trying to do these mechanisms. We just can't. So this is the state of science as of last month. So I have a few problems with this. And so I'll just kind of walk through so you can see their problems. First, there's no such thing as a protocell. This is a made-up thing that they have said happens. This is what has to happen. But they've never made anything in a laboratory that even resembles what they describe a protocell to be. The important thing about a protocell, it must have an outside layer that selectively lets things in and lets things out. And the important thing about living is we let big things in and we keep small things out. Now think about that for a second. It's not a strainer. We let big things come in, but we keep teeny weeny things out. So it's not, there has to be a function to the membrane layer. In fact, no one has ever made a membrane in a laboratory. They've made things that look like membranes, but effectively they're a bubble. Can't let anything in. And if they make them leaky, then it lets everything in. Even water it's a problem for a living cell. It has to control how the water goes in and out, or the cell would die. So it's complicated. I mean, a living cell actually maintains a charge balance between the inside and outside. Your cells have electrical signals going through them in a way that it's like per surface area, it's like a lightning bolt in every single living cell when you think of it per square area. And it's happening in all, 100 million of your cells or whatever it is you have. So, okay, so the protocell, come on. And the phosphorylation, until you can demonstrate it, you can't say this. And the problem is when they got into their paper, by the midway, it was this is how it happened. It went from could be to this is. It's this phraseology change where they start with, oh, I can imagine this, and then by step 5, they're talking about the one they said they could imagine as if it was fact. And it's like they just imagined it. It's still not fact. The bottom line is things like phosphorylation that they describe making double helix molecules have never been observed outside of a living organism, period. It just hasn't. We've tried, and they have tried. And when they have made things that look like it, there's no message to it, right? There's no sequence. It's just random, and usually the two biolayers don't match. The amazing thing about DNA, it's actually two exact replicates of each other that go in opposite directions. I mean, think about that for a second. A message that's perfect in one direction and the other direction, and it's 3.5 billion characters long. How do you do that? Well, you can't replicate it in the lab, I promise you that. I mean, and it actually has information laid into it. It's amazing what God has made. Well, that's a whole nother conversation. Now, they'll talk about RNA replication versus DNA replication, but they're ignoring the scientific barriers to their concepts. I can imagine that it can replicate, but I can't show you how it would replicate. and I can't demonstrate how it would replicate. And my problem with science, if I can't see it, if I can't demonstrate it, it's science fiction, not science. Now, that's how we postulate things, I understand, but you can't call it science until you've proven that it is. It's just,
They're violating their own
it's not even a theory, it's a hypothesis. It's a guess, it's an educated guess.
The problem is that
Fifth step, it becomes this is how it happens. It's like you said it could.
Well, that's always the problem, it quit being a question, because if it was a question, then there's no step 5. And that's the problem. So, I mean, you walk back through these, the vesicule, we've never observed one of these just happening in nature. They only happen from living organisms. And people have demonstrated if you put the right fatty acids together in the right concentration, in the right pH, in the right liquid, then they tend to form these little bubble things. But they have no function to them. They're just a bubble. They're basically a little compartment. And you have to work really hard to make it. And they're also not stable, right? So you don't have time working on your case. So this idea that had a bunch of lipids laying around and they magically became a bilayer, okay, I'll get that, but then it makes a 3-dimensional shape that has purpose. Random doesn't get there. Random gets you more chaos. It doesn't get you. And unfortunately, the ones that we use for life are not the ones that naturally chemistry wants to drive you toward. They drive us toward the ones that don't support life. I mean, God knows what he's doing. The things that happen inside the cell can't happen outside the cell. If they were happening outside the cell, I don't know what that would do to us. It might make our environments pollute. I don't know. And then obviously the last part of their hypothesis was the fatty acids. And it's like, where did you get the fatty acids? I mean, it can't be, we're not talking about a molecular weight of 4 or 5. We're talking about hundreds that have to be in the right configuration, the right geometry. That means they have to have the right types of bends, the right type of active groups. Because if they don't, then they won't line up. You can't make a lipid layer. It doesn't have any function. So they laid out a map with landmarks on it, yet they don't know where any of the landmarks are. What kind of a map is that? If you give me 5 landmarks, but neither me, the one that wrote the map, or you, the one that's reading the map, know where the landmarks are. That's not a map at all. It's just a picture. And a picture is not necessarily reality. So again, state of the art, kind of sad. All right. You guys want to take a quick break before we beat on evolution a little bit?